Thanks everyone for coming. So this is part of our Indigenous Women's Leadership Network series where we host different webinars on professional development, educational content. If you ever have a suggestion for a session topic, please feel free to email us. You can email us at admin, ADMIN, at IWLN.org. Or always feel free to contact me, heather.tanana at law.utah.edu. And I'll try and put those in the chat as well. So topic ideas, suggestions, things that you think can help you in your career path or professional development, always open to topic suggestions as well as speaker recommendations. So today we're really excited because this is part of a 2-series training on communication and media strategies. And so today is the first session, and we'll be with Matt Mosley, who I'll introduce in just one second. And then next Monday, same time, over the noon hour Mountain Time, we'll have our second session where we're bringing in 2 reporters who write on topics related to the Colorado River Basin and Indigenous issues, Luke Runyon and Felicia Fonseca. So really hope you'll be able to join us next week as well. But leading into the first part today, we're really happy to have Matt Mosley here. Matt is a communication strategist, author, speaker, and really cool fact, he's a world record adventure swimmer as well. So he spent a lot of time in the water, in the Colorado River as well. And his career is really at the intersection of public policy, business, and government. And he's managed a lot of public affairs projects and campaigns for different organizations and companies. Currently, he's the principal and CEO of Ignition Strategy Group, which specializes in high-stakes communications and issue management. And he also has a book out, Ignition: Superior Communication Strategies for Creating Stronger Connections, as well as other materials. So really happy to turn the time over to Matt. We have a nice small group here. We're hoping people will feel comfortable to comment, and we have our Q&A function as he goes through different strategies for your own communication. All right, and with that, Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Heather. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us over your lunch hour today. It's a pleasure to be with you all. It's one of my favorite things to do to not be in a crisis is to be talking about being in a crisis and how you do communication. So it's a lot of fun. And, we come to this because Heather also is a part of the Water and Tribes Initiative, and I do communications with them. I also work with other organizations such as American Rivers, and I've worked with them for about 15 years on different hydro issues and kind of some real contentious water wars in the West. I also serve as the co-chair for their Southwest River Council, and I'm pretty involved. We just got back from a DC lobbying trip that was all about messaging last week, and that was really exciting. Also work with the Colorado River District and other organizations. And really, my work spans all sorts of different issues, whether it's education, transportation, or energy, but about half of my work is spent on water, because I think water is the most critical issue of our time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the message and media training today. So I sort of have my day job, and Heather mentioned my night job is as a writer, and I'm an author. And in this book, Ignition, I wanted to frame all of my experiences and those of others in how you approach communications. People talk about why it's so important, but they don't really tell you how to be a good communicator. I also wrote the book because I believe that leadership is, communications and leadership go hand in hand, and that it's really tough to be a good leader if you can't be a good communicator and you don't inspire people to have a vision about what you want to see happening in the world. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as, the nexus between leadership and communication and how that really matters. And so that's my night job is as an author, and my early morning swimmer job is as an open water swimmer. as Heather mentioned. I was the first person to swim 50 miles down the Colorado River through Canyonlands. And then also last summer swam 40 miles down the Green River through Canyonlands. And you can check that out in a short documentary produced by American Rivers called Silent River. We could put that in the chat. And I mention that because my open water swimming is a way for me to bring attention to water issues. It's a communications tactic. It also helps me keep sane and fit and not go completely crazy, but it's a way to bring attention to water. And whether it's plastics in the Caribbean, whether it was water management, swimming across the Sea of Galilee, or drought and scarcity and climate change in the West. Water has a lot to tell us. And so that's why I think this nexus between communications and water is really important, because we have a big story to tell about water that I think is not being told as it really should be. And we need to kind of get out there. So one of the my interesting experiences in my life was working for this pretty famous journalist who was a kind of crazy guy. And one night we worked on this campaign over 5 or 6 years to free a young woman from prison who was in prison for serving life without parole for felony murder for a crime she did not commit. And so we're sitting in his kitchen one night, and the journalist asked me, he says, "Do you know what the meaning of the word politics is?" And I had worked for the Clinton White House. I've worked at Rock the Vote. I've been campaigns and politics basically my whole life. And I could not answer this basic question. And I thought, what is the meaning of the word politics? Governing, voting? No, he said that politics is the art of controlling your environment. And those who control their environment the best win the day. And then what that means is it means about being proactive. It means communicating your own vision of what you want to see have happen in the world. And that's where the nexus of leadership and communication really comes in, because a leader has to be skilled at controlling their environment or they can't get anything done. And so to do that, the tool is communication. And that's why it's so important. Now, being proactive, there's a term in business called first mover advantage. So kind of think like Tesla. It always comes with risks, and there are pitfalls. But generally, as communicators, as leaders, we want to be proactive. We want to be defining the story and setting the agenda and have people talking in our own terms, using our own language. And so that's where it's really important to think about this art of controlling your environment, because it really is everything. Now, before we talk about the nuts and bolts today of our main thing about media relations and communications, I want to kind of give you a couple of principles about how I approach media relations and communications. And I use them sort of interchangeably, but media relations is a very specific subset of the overall communication. And when I talk overall communication, I'm thinking it could be how you interact and communicate with your funders, your stakeholders, your internal audiences. What are your external audiences, members? It could be anybody out there. Media is really just kind of one subset of sort of your overall communications audience. But anytime that we are engaging in this process, right, and we have an issue, we want to take people on an emotional journey. So what is that? And before I go into the emotional journey, what I want to encourage everybody here to do today is have a little piece of paper next to you, because what we're going to do is I'd like you to take a moment and think of an issue that's really important to you. Maybe, it's, Water and Tribes Initiative. What's our communications plan, and how are we going to think about, the upcoming challenges for the river this fall and this summer? You may have a public engagement campaign or a fundraising effort or a dam you have to get taken down or a water storage you got to get built, or what is it that is important to you that you would need to communicate about? And so I want you to take that issue and we're going to roll through it, for the whole session today. And then by the end of it, you should be able to come out with a pretty good back of the napkin communication plan to help you on your journey. But when we're talking about the emotional journey, we want to get people and we want to think about ourselves, what we want people to think, feel, and do. This thinking, do we want them to think yes or no? What kind of connection do we want them to have? How do we want them to feel? Do we want them to feel disgusted or inspired or, concerned, scared, afraid? And fear is a big tactic, obviously, as we know. And then what do we want them to do? Do we want them to vote? Do we want them to show up? Do we want them to contribute or write a letter? So thinking about that emotional journey is one of the first steps that we take that's going to basically be our sort of goals and objectives and how we formulate where we want to go with a communications plan or when we're speaking to the media. So think about this emotional journey and as you relate it to your own issue, take just a second here to fill in those blanks. With the Water and Tribes Initiative, we want people to think a certain way. We want them to feel that we're collaborative and that we work with others and that we know what we're talking about and that we're informed. And then the do, what do we want them to do? So take a second and fill that in for your issue here. Now, as you're doing that, luckily today we're not in a crisis, and maybe some of you are facing your own crisis, and I probably could argue that we're in a slow-moving glacial crisis of the Colorado River Basin and what's happening there. And this applies just as much in this case. If you think about any sort of communication engagement, especially in a crisis, you have your two axes of control and time. And as time moves out, you lose control. So the quicker you can address a crisis, address a situation, the quicker you can be proactive, the better you're going to be. And the more control you're going to have over your message. And that control is very important because the being proactive aspect of communicating is that we don't want other people to define us for ourselves. It's our responsibility as leaders, as communicators, to define our own vision and to put that out there so that people understand and know. And that's what gives us legitimacy and credibility. So this sort of initial time and control is a really important way to think about things. And also, no offense to anybody who might be an attorney or engineers, but oftentimes I get, we can't say anything about that because we don't know, or we don't have all the information, or the lawyers will sort of pull you back and don't want you to get in trouble. And that's all fine and good, but it doesn't mean you go silent and in a vacuum, right? That's where other people take control and we frankly lose control of our own message. And so sometimes that's where our job as communicators is to push back against the attorneys and say, no, look, I think this is what we have to do. And even if we can't say that we know everything, we do know some things. And so let's get out there and that, show them that we're learning about this issue and we're communicating and showing leadership through that communication. So the next principle I want to share with you, and I'm going to spend a second here because I find this to be so vitally important. And as you think about this, you'll know people that and nothing against people in academics at all. I teach classes sometimes myself, but we deal with a lot of smart people in the world and people who are really, really smart and they know a lot and they love to explain. And they love to talk and they'll present graphs and data. And we see this in the water world, right? Lots of CFS and lots of hydrographics and things like that. But what we're missing sometimes is the point. What are you trying to tell me? What do I need to do? Why is this important? And so, what I really want to encourage you to do today is to think about in your communications, if you're teaching a class, if you're delivering a speech somewhere, what is the point? When you only have a 30 seconds on a TV interview to get your message across, or you have 3 sentences in a AP article or a news article, what is that point? Because you can't be out here. You need to tell them what it is that you want to say right now. And then you can explain why this is important, what are the stakes involved, and what's our story, because that's what people are going to remember. And then we always want to talk about our solutions as well. But always remember to start with the point. And then if you want to end with the point and end again and repeat your point over and over, that's how we get people to understand and to resonate with what we're talking about. I won't tell you who it is, but right now I'm working with a Stanford engineer who is extremely smart, and we are running a half-page ad in a newspaper, and I got 15 pages of single-spaced text that I have to condense down and to figure out what is that point. And so, we all see it happening, and you'll notice it sometimes now that I've said this in sort of some of your daily lives, like, hey, let's get to the point, and we always love a good factual, logical explanation, but what people remember and what they respond to is a good point and being very clear. So now I want to shift gears a little bit into the second part of our presentation today in the training, where we talk a little bit about kind of communications planning. Now, this is also where I want you to think about your issue that you're kind of working through today and whatever that might be. It's a fairly simple process. That communications planning, we always ask the 3 basic questions. What are you saying? And that's all your messaging, your history, context. You might have polling, data, research that all goes into a crystallization of a really tight, good message that's very clear. I could spend my whole time here today just talking about this very one thing about messaging. But the second piece of your communications plan is going to be, who are you saying it to? And what are your audiences? Sometimes you might be speaking to your internal group of stakeholders. Sometimes you're speaking to people that are top kind of grass tops policymakers, and they really know what they're talking about. It's a little deeper. And sometimes you're talking to people that have no clue at all. And so what are you going to say to them? And then lastly, my favorite piece of this puzzle is the tactics. How are you going to say it? And we know that there are so many ways to communicate in the world these days. What we want to do later on is we're going to focus on picking a couple of those tactics and then doing them really well. Now, sometimes I get a call and they're like, Matt, I have a really big issue. Can I take you out for a beer? And we'll put it on the back of a napkin and we'll run through this little communications plan. And it's just a way to think about a problem, or even a proactive way that you want to get something out there and you need to get some action going. Sometimes these communications plan, if you're a big organization, might be 120 pages of 3 to 5 year public engagement effort for a transportation agency, say, or your big strategic plan that would then be a subset. It would have a communications plan in it. And let me just mention about that real quick, because lately I feel like I've been working with a number of organizations, sometimes on developing strategic plans. And sometimes they put in communications, but many times it's an afterthought. And they'll develop their whole strategic plan, and then 1 or 2 years later say, we need a communications plan. And I should really encourage you to make that part of the process, because your strategic plan is your communications plan. That's what you're going to be communicating. And that's your roadmap. So they really should be kind of one document and at least be a subset or an appendix of each other. So I really encourage that. But let's move on now to talking a little bit about messaging and the message frame. So that's the first part of our communications plan. So when we work with folks, sometimes whether they're CEOs, sometimes people that speak to the media 4 or 5 times a week, nearly every day, sometimes people once a month, but we always encourage people, no matter how skilled, no matter how developed and polished they might be, to before they answer a question from the media, before they do anything, is they put their thoughts down in a message triangle. And so you see right here, I have the point is right there in the middle to keep us grounded, but it's pretty simple. Whenever you get a call from a reporter, and you need to sort of frame your communications, you want to first talk about who you are, why you're here, like what are the stakes, why is it important, and here's how we're addressing it. And this allows you to stay in this framework and keep going back to your core messaging, whatever that might be. So take a second, and with your own issue that you're sort of training on today and you're thinking about, what is your message framework? And I'm going to come back, and I'd like to, if anybody wants to kind of put something in the chat or would like to offer up what their messaging might be for an issue, I'd love to hear what people are kind of working on out there. But just to give you an example of how this might work, and please don't share this. This is just sort of an internal thing that we did this fall for a one media call. But with the Water and Tribes Initiative, this is sort of how we framed this particular inquiry, where we are 30 tribes throughout the basin. We're really lacking in involvement. We have 40% of the rights, but no voice. And was really talking about the Colorado Compact. So we related it back to that we didn't have a role in the Colorado Compact. And then we went through why and what we do have a role to play. And then our how was about the expectation of a promise made, and that we wanted to build on the work that the tribes are already doing, and that we do have a role to play, and that we are part of the solution. And so that kept us pretty tight and grounded. So take a second, and what is your own message frame for your own organization? And if anybody wants to share, please let me know. All righty. When we talk about messaging too, I always think about it. People throw this term around pretty loosely, and sometimes it's a paragraph, sometimes it's a document, sometimes it's mostly what is condensed to be on your website is your kind of a great way to think about your first cut at messaging. When you're thinking about it, I want you to go through a couple of different checkpoints here. Does it address a public need? What is the greater public good? Is it clear? Sometimes you'd be surprised when you get a bunch of cooks in the kitchen, it can get all gobbledygooky and it doesn't really sound right, even though you're checking all the boxes of all the right words. It's not necessarily clear. Is it consistent? Sometimes people have a really, really great idea and it's very sizzly and out of the box, but it doesn't really match the voice of an organization or kind of the channels that it will be communicated in. So you want to make sure that your language is really consistent. And then along with clarity, does it capture the main point that you're trying to get across? And as we've talked about this today, you go through the next week, and before you talk to Felicia and Luke, look for examples of good and bad messaging. We have to look no further than the Super Bowl sometimes. And, people spend millions of dollars on an ad, and you finish the ad and you said, who was that for? And what were they trying to get me to do? I'm not really clear on that. So you always just want to kind of have a good check. And then does the tone and spark match the organization's voice? That's kind of the consistency there. And then one of the big pieces is the credibility. We are here as subject matter experts, and that you all have a voice to offer and a perspective. And that's why you are here. And that's why you're having the conversation. And the work that you do really matters. So you are a credible spokesperson, but that legitimacy and gravitas is really important to sort of uphold and to believe in yourself of why you are a good spokesperson for this issue. And then kind of coming back to the public need, but the common good. What's the common good? And I always try to, good messaging, if it rings true, if it rings clear, is going to be something greater than yourself. It's going to be some higher purpose. And I can think right now of no higher purpose than water in the Colorado Basin and showing sort of leadership in that space. And so I think that would be something that you were all working towards on this session. So people always talk about telling good stories. You got to tell a good story. Oh, it's all storytelling now. But they don't really tell you how. They don't tell you how to tell a good story. And so I want to bring us back to our college literature class. If you ever just, read about the hero cycle or the hero's journey, I was going to call this slide the heroine cycle, but I thought that the language might be a little construed on that one. So we went away from that language. But you'll see here that our heroine is charging off on a call to adventure, a purpose. She's looking for treasure or wisdom. She goes across her journey and she crosses her first threshold where she meets other mentors and helpers. She also may meet challenges and bad people and along the way, and that things that take her off the mission. There'll be helpers and there'll be challenges along the way. But then, like every great story, there's a rebirth and a death, that you kind of go to the abyss, and then there's a revelation that happens, and we continue on as a transformed person. And one of my favorite pieces in all great stories is the reconciliation with the mother or father figure. You could think of Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz and Auntie Em. You could also think of Luke Skywalker in Star Wars and Obi-Wan Kenobi when he gives him the Force. May the Force be with you. These are transformative moments of change, right? And these happen in our own lives as well, along our own journeys. And then there's the return with wisdom and something for a boon for the community that we bring home with us after our journey is complete. Now, I talk about the hero cycle because when we talk about good stories, every good story follows this cycle right here. You can maybe start at different places. You could start with a transformation or atonement and then work your way through, but usually they start going on some kind of adventure. And the same is true for the kind of things that we do too. We're going to start off, our adventure might happen to be bringing public awareness to water issues in the West. And what kind of adventures will those lead us on? But one thing to consider, because every good story, every good communications plan you need heroes and you need villains. And so think about who those are in your own story cycle. And where, as you kind of think about the point of your story, kind of put it in the middle here, and how does that relate? And so one thing that I think is interesting is that sometimes I've worked with like political candidates who think they are the hero, right? Sometimes people that write advertising think that the product is the hero. Well, in a political campaign or a public education effort, the voter is the hero. The citizen is the hero. And the candidate and the policy is here to help that citizen have a better day and a better journey and to glide them safely across troubled waters. Sometimes when you put yourself in the story, you're not thinking of the sort of greater good that can happen. So that the voter in a campaign is really the hero, and the issue, the ballot measure is what's going to help solve their problems. If you're writing a commercial, let's say for hair shampoo, I I want lustrous hair so I can look good before a media training, right? Or a big meeting. And so the shampoo, I'm the hero here, and the shampoo is my helper. So always be thinking about who your sort of heroes and villains and helpers and who the heroes of your own story are. And so every good communication effort needs to have a heroine, a hero, and also what that journey is. It's sort of taking us back, right, to the opening about the emotional journey and taking people on the emotional journey, and who are the heroes in that, and the villains, who helps us get there, and what are the transformational points in that journey. In any sort of big campaign, you want to go through sort of cycles of like persuasion or education, then there's persuasion, and then there's action. And so it's kind of the same thing. We're just taking sort of Hollywood script writing and applying it to our own issue. And the hero cycle, the heroine cycle, it is a story that is as timeless as all religious texts, the Greek mythologies, Shakespeare. I mentioned the Wizard of Oz. All great stories sort of fall from this cycle. And so think about it for your own work and how that fits in. Just sort of bringing it home here. The second question that we're going to ask about who are you communicating to, now that you have your messaging, you sort of know what your goals are and where you're going. What are your audiences? Who are the people that matter to you? So I always try to break these down into this internal piece of the stakeholders and the members of your community, maybe members of the tribe and other kind of people that affect your world. But then there's the external audiences. And this is absolutely where media would come in. Obviously, social media is such a huge piece of communicating these days. Policymakers, elected officials, you can definitely, voter lists are very available. The thing about, Silicon Valley these days, it is a whole industry based on targeting. So if you really, really want to target people, there are ways to do that these days. The good thing is that it gives us really good metrics about who we're talking to and what the reactions are. But the bad thing is that it gives us too much information about what people are doing. No, the bad thing is that it's taken away real traditional media about, and people sort of really reporting on issues. And that's why you're more important than ever, because as leaders in this space, you're going to be looked to respond and to these audiences. And so to really understand how these break down, and then your messaging might be different, let's say for funders, than it is for your own stakeholders. It might be different for the reporter than it is for a radio host on a certain show. So you always want to just be tailoring that message to what your audiences are. And it's very important to think about that. My favorite piece, and we're not going to go into it too much today. Again, I could talk for another hour on just tactics, because tactics are really the where the rubber meets the road. It's how the messaging is sort of translated to the audiences. And I think that in our tactics, we have what I call the Holy Trinity. We have three things that we're dealing with. We have time, we have money, and we have people. And they're all shrinking. And sometimes we don't have very much money, but we have more time and we got a few people. Sometimes we got money, but we don't have people. And a lot of times we don't have enough time. It seems to be always we don't have enough time. but really you don't have enough of any of the resources. We could always use more. But thinking about tactics, right? There are so many myriad of tactics to use today in communicating. At the Water and Tribes Initiative, we write white papers. We do press releases. There are conferences, and we speak at conferences, and we hosted our own conference. And so think about what are your tactics in your organizations and your channels for how you communicate. There's email lists, there's social media, there's other digital formats and ways. There is door to door, which I always find very, very effective. Personal communication is always the most purest and best. That's how you really move people, is if you can talk to them in person. But then it sort of flows out from there, where like text is probably unless it's somebody you're really acquainted with, is probably the least meaningful. But as you get farther removed, the messaging gets tougher to stick. And that's just a kind of a rubric here. And so as I want to leave some time for Q&A, but if we put this all together, we can come up with a template that you can use for really any subject and any challenge. We took you through the analysis and research of the emotional journey about, thinking through what you want people to do, and that would determine your approach and then your goals and objectives and what you want to achieve. And this is so important because I have worked with a number of organizations in the past where they don't really know what they want. And it makes it very difficult then to design a effective communication strategy for a long term if people are constantly shifting gears about what they want and what they need and who they are. But we have goals and objectives, then we do story time, and that's our messaging. That's the crystallization of who we are and our values and what we stand for. And then targeting. I have here data is the new beacon, but it should say data is the new bacon, because you can't live without data. And it's one of the plus things of the digital world is that we know if our stuff is being effective or not. But that's the targeting the audiences. Then we have the tactical execution. Go out there. What are the tactics you're going to match to get the best messaging across your audiences? And that's where strategy comes in, sort of thinking about it, planning it, making it, live. And that's when you're ready to implement it and get out there and do it in the action. And then finally, is it working? You can evaluate. And that's where, I encourage you to think of your communications planning as a very iterative process that you're always sort of learning, developing. And with our jobs, new information appears all the time where we have to sort of adjust what we're doing according to the new information. So that's basically the communications planning in a nutshell. And so if you were to take your issue, you would have messaging. Who were your audiences? If you jotted a couple of those down, might be a good idea to jot down what are a couple of your tactics. What do you do well? How do you communicate with people? What could you do better? It's a good question. And then what's, kind of putting it together in this template. So before we end our time and go into questions, I just want to lastly go through a couple of do's and don'ts. And, I'd like to, if we could, don't quote me on any of these, please. These are just some things that I take and lessons from the field. And sometimes they work for others and sometimes they don't, but these are just some of my suggestions. But the first one is, do the work, write up things. If you're going to try to get something in the newspaper or you want it on the news, write it up so they can just drop it in. Reporters are so stressed these days, and the media is they don't do the long form stories and reporting that they used to do. So that's incumbent upon us to do their job for them. So write up things that they can just, think like a reporter, think like they would, and what would they need to just put something in the paper. Felicia Fonseca may disagree with me from the Associated Press when she speaks next week, but I like to sometimes talk to reporters some of our issues are very complex and they can't be answered necessarily in a soundbite right away. So I like to, with a reporter is to be able to just talk on background, and they're usually okay with that. Um, can I be free to share with you my perspective? And then if you'd like to pull out a quote or something, let's talk about that. You want to give them something juicy to go home with, but you just don't want to get in trouble by sharing too much. So talk to them off the record and be honest. And sometimes this is a good space to educate reporters because they really don't know what you know. They're not going to know as much. So use it as a chance to sort of educate them on your issues. A media inquiry. So when a media call happens, generally, you should have a process in your organization for what that protocol is. Um, so generally, in the Water and Tribes Initiative, Colorado River District, and other organizations I work with, we may get a call from, let's say, the Associated Press, and we say, "Thank you so much, Felicia. I really appreciate the question and your call today. What are you working on? Can I call you back?" And what this does is it allows us to, okay, who's the right person to respond to this? And let's get our thoughts together and form a message triangle to respond to this question so that, in the 3 sentences we're going to get in this article, it is exactly what we want to have said. And we're not just sort of all over the place. Remember, getting to the point and sticking with that point. And that's what message discipline is all about. It's creating that message triangle, having your point, and sticking to it constantly. Now, I talked about the art of controlling your environment. You are a subject matter expert, an SME, if you will, in the industry. So have the confidence, have the control to be in control of your own interview. Now, just a little trick, what reporters love to do, especially, maybe not if they're trying to learn about water, but if it's a general call, they will ask you a question and then be quiet. There'll be a awkward pause after you've answered the question. Now, what they want you to do is they want you to keep going and just sort of talking and spewing in hopes that you'll say something really juicy. Don't give in to that. Just say what you need to say. Here's the point, and then be quiet and let them ask the next question. Don't feel the need to just keep talking. We talked about this, the big picture in the checkpoints for good media is that making things greater than yourself. That's why I swim. That's why I know you all do a lot of the work that you do, is because these are bigger issues than just me or our communities. These are, drought and water. These are things that we're all faced with right now. And so the greater good is something to really keep in mind as we move forward into this uncertain future. With tactics, I mentioned this earlier, there's so many things that people can do. And I've seen sort of, let's do this and let's do this and let's do this. Pick a couple of things and do them really well. And that's what you'll get known for. And that's where people will come to see you as more, it's a way to express leadership in that you're sort of disciplined about what you're doing and that you bring focus to your communications. And then lastly, you are controlling your environment. When sometimes reporters, we will have a press conference about a certain issue and they'll say, well, hey, that was great about Western Water, but I really want to know about the plane ride you took over here and how much money you all spent on this conference. Something completely out of left field. And that sometimes happens if you are out there proactively communicating. Well, there's a simple solution to this. And you say, you know what? I'm not here to talk today about plane rides. We'll talk about that later. I'm here today to talk about Western water issues and drought in the Southwest. And stick to your point, no matter what. Sometimes that can be hard, but that's where the discipline comes in. So those are sort of my tips. I'd love to take some questions. I just wanted to, I realized that people my Ignition book was a lot of fun and people love talking about communications, but I have a new book coming out at the end of May called Soul is Waterproof. It's about adventure swimming and stories of water. And this is a communications tactic of using a book about swimming to talk about water issues around the world. And so it's what I can do to contribute to this issue and kind of my thing. And so with that, I'll leave you today and just want to say one line, and that is do not look outside of yourself for a leader. You are the one you've been waiting for. So thank you very much, everybody.
Well, thanks so much for that, Matt. And again, I want to reiterate, put in the chat function has been enabled. We also have the Q&A for people who have questions. If you wrote down on a napkin or piece of paper, a couple lines of what your key point would be for your communication strategy, feel free to share it. You can get some tips here from Matt and some feedback. So while we're waiting to see if anyone else has some questions, I just had a few that popped up while you were going. Matt, you talked about the message triangle, how that's a really great method to use when you're thinking through your message. And I love those. It seemed pretty easy. Who are you? Why are you here? How are we addressing it? When we're putting that together, just is it like 4 bullet points for each thing? I mean, you don't have a lot of time, right? And so what's just like realistically back of the hand, like how in depth should we be going? Because I know we can't cover everything. You said focus. So tips of how many bullet points on each of those.
Yeah, so that's a great question because you could spend the whole time just talking about number one, like who you are, right? And so you want to, I think, 2 to 3 bullet points. And I tried to demonstrate that under the Water and Tribes initiative slide. But, with the Indigenous Women's Leadership Network, you could say something like, we support current leaders by protecting communities and the environment and building relationships throughout the basin. And we do this by exchanging information, and we develop leadership and other professional skills. And then you would talk about, right now we are facing severe drought shortage in the West. And then how is the network responding to that? What are our solutions? What are we doing? And that's where you're creating professional development and developing skills and enhancing the capacity.
Like that. The other thing, when you're talking about the heroine kind of storyline and saying how it's important to identify a villain, I think automatically in my mind, I think of a villain as being a person and that, and again, in my work, right, I talk a lot about federal treaty trust responsibility. So it's the failure of the federal government to uphold that and the consequences that have happened. But it also made me wonder, like, that villain doesn't necessarily have to be a person, right?
Not at all. Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, the fact that, in fact, it's probably better. So yeah, I like the fact that you relate it to a policy or regulations or treaties that are, sort of non-personal, because I really like the non-personal whenever you can, not making, and I use the term villain because that's kind of the script, piece, but it's really about the challenges and the obstacles that you have to face on your journey. What are those that you have to break down to have transformation?
Yeah. Because we talk a lot about like building partnerships, and seemed like it could be an easy pitfall to antagonize some kind of already intense.
Yeah, no, and I think it's not necessarily about antagonizing. It's about recognizing what your challenges are, and the real, having the situational awareness to really say, yeah, it's not maybe a person, but it's a treaty. It's sort of institutional blocks that are really the challenge here that we have to get over. And with the Colorado Compact, I don't think any of the individual states would be villains in this negotiation, in our sort of interim guideline process and what's going on here. It's the process that could be the villain. And I don't know. I mean, so that's why it's sometimes worth, really diving into what are those challenges, because sometimes they're not what you think that they are. And, you know, just a really good identification is helpful.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Another, as you were talking about um, at the end of media and focusing in on your message and not trying to cover too much, and then it reminded me, and I'm curious if you would agree, something that I've done in my discussions with reporters about the Colorado River Basin and water is to, when I'm done talking with them, is to also refer them over to other specific individuals that I think they should talk to. And it's, for me, it's been a nice, like, I can't cover everything. I'm not a hydrologist, or, I don't know all these details. I'm not the best source on this point, but I can partner with someone who I trust, who I think is credible. And I'm going to call him out, Crystal.
Yeah, Crystal.
Hi. She does understand different areas of water that I don't. And that kind of like tag team approach seems like it could be beneficial in some cases.
Oh yeah. Well, then we have the attorney and the engineer talking. No, and so that is such an excellent point, Heather, because it's naive to think that that reporter is only calling you. They're going to be calling other people too. And so why not lead them in the right direction instead of calling somebody that you don't have any idea about? And so that sort of extra educational piece is really good. And then just make sure if you do that, then you you ping Crystal and say, "Hey, Crystal, I think you might be getting a call real quick about this issue," because then Crystal can put her message triangle together and sort of go from there.
Yeah. Yeah. So you don't have to do it alone, I guess, or feel like you're the only one to kind of advocate on certain issues or topics.
Well, not to call out Crystal, but since we are, Crystal, was there an issue that you had a communications challenge that you sort of uh, made a plan around or a message frame?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to put it on the spot there.
There you go. Yep. Water in general in the Navajo Nation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so again, feel free. Any questions, jump in. Otherwise, the other comment, yeah. Oh, exactly. Because you have one issue of water, and there's so many different components that can relate to it. Um, and so it seems like you could even have message point, like of your topic, and then different branches off where you do like sub message triangles, right?
Absolutely. And it should be kind of very specific for that purpose. So for instance, if you had one that was like clean water access would be probably different than, let's say, drought, right? So, you sort of want to tailor it to this sort of very specific kind of inquiry or what you were dealing with. And where it really comes in handy is when there's this very broad questions or very general type of tell me about this. And that's when I see people sort of, all over the board instead of just like starting with the point. Here is what we do in our network. And this is why it's important. This is, water on the Navajo Nation is boom. What is that? And so really leading with that, I cannot stress enough.
Yeah. Yeah. So the why you are here also seems like under that is what's the articulating what you view the problem to be, right?
Very much so. This is how we perceive the kind of the challenge or the opportunity, and then what we're doing about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also like, Crystal noted there that audience is important because it often will change. And sometimes you're talking with people who don't, I've talked to reporters who that's the first story they're covering on the basin. They have, no in-depth knowledge of what tribal water rights are. And so it's very easy to get down these tangent lines. And yeah.
Yep. Well, and that's a little bit why okay, so here's my message triangle for the very specific question. But if I'm going to talk on background a little bit, it kind of frees you up to provide that educational background. Like, yeah, let me just give you a little primer on tribal water rights for a second, that's not on the record, just so that they understand, that can be really helpful and not taking things out of context.
Yeah. Yeah. And one last thing that kind of resonated with me as you were talking today, Matt, was this comment about just because we don't know everything to an absolute degree of certainty doesn't mean that sometimes you can't comment on it. And you're absolutely right. As an attorney, like, we never like to say absolutes. And so we're always in some way, well, most likely that would happen, right? Like, I would never say this will happen.
Right.
But in some of the work I was doing, we actually looked at communication of scientists and how, because it's the same thing in the science field where they like to qualify with degrees of certainty. And as a result, it was kind of this barrier of communicating with the public about like climate change risks and impacts, because there was this hesitancy to say something is happening, because again, couldn't say 100% sure. And as a result, it was kind of like diminishing the impact, or the general public thought it wasn't as important as it was.
Sure. When I think that scientists, are especially this sort of explain data, graphs, facts, and then they kind of tell you at the end, like, well, here's the real point of it all, because you're like, what does this all mean here? I find it pretty funny.
Yeah. And then one clarification here in our Q&A, if you say background, does that mean everyone would know you're talking off the record? Or do you have to really make that clear to the reporter?
It's either way, but they just, so that people are clear you were off the record, at that time. And if they come back and say, hey, that was really good, do you mind if I use that? Say, sure, but at least it just gives you the freedom to talk and to explain, kind of that's your education portion.
Perfect.
And so, like, for a good example is that ProPublica did a very in-depth series of articles. I don't know if you all remember, they came out in the kind of November, December timeframe. And, they called and had an hour-long conversation with Daryl that was just all background, just so that they could feel as reporters that they were accurately covering this issue and knew what was going on. So, and being a resource for them like that, because sometimes people are cagey and they don't want to do that. And I feel like we have, really good relationships with, by the way, there's probably, like, for all you all probably know, but there's maybe 12 to 15 people who are really covering Colorado River Basin issues, that are really writing about it. And you have some other people who kind of pop in every now and then, but, kind of, I think we have some good relationships with those folks, and they sort of know who we are, and we're developing a good kind of speakers bureau. That's what we'd love to do at the Water and Tribes Initiative, is say, hey, great question. The best person you can talk to about this is Crystal. And then we let Crystal know that they're going to call. But, it's really kind of farming out the media inquiries more to specific experts on different specific things.
Well, perfect. Well, and that's a great transition for next week, when we have Luke and Felicia come in person to talk about exactly those kind of more in-depth detail. Media has called you. What do you do? What's it going to be like? Or maybe they haven't called you and you wish they would. And so we'll get feedback from that in that area as well. Matt, thank you so much again for your time. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll have this, it was recorded. We'll be able to share it with people who were not able to attend, and just hope you're able to join us again next week. So thank you.
Can't wait. Thank you, everybody.